The wagon arrived on an October morning when the light came in low and flat across the valley, throwing long shadows off every stone and ridge. The woman was 24 years old. She had married in the spring, signed papers in the summer, and now sat on the wagon bench with her hands folded in her lap, watching the claim come into view for the first time. It was not what either of them had been told it would be. The cabin leaned slightly east, as though it had spent years listening for something coming from that direction, and had never quite straightened back up. The chinking between the logs had dried to a dusty gray and fallen out in stretches, leaving gaps that the October wind found without any trouble. The door hung on a single iron hinge. The step was a flat stone sunk crookedly into the mud. A person could look at it for 5 minutes and reach the same conclusion the land office man had nearly said aloud when he handed over the deed, that someone had sold this claim the moment they understood what it was worth. Her husband climbed down first and stood with his hands on his hips, saying nothing for a long moment. Then he said something about the cabin being fixable, and she did not disagree because she was already looking past it. The hillside rose directly behind the cabin, steep and close. It was composed almost entirely of crumbling shale, gray-brown slabs that had been breaking apart for longer than anyone had homesteaded this valley. There was no real soil to speak of, not on that slope. Their nearest neighbor had told them the same thing 2 miles back down the road, slowing his horse long enough to observe that nothing had ever grown there, and nothing was likely to start. He had not been unkind about it. He had simply been certain. She walked to the base of the hill while her husband began unloading the wagon. The shale was loose underfoot, shifting and clicking with each step. She moved slowly, not from caution, but because she was reading the ground the way a person reads a page, one detail at a time. The hill faced southwest. By afternoon, it would collect every hour of sun the season still had to offer. She pressed her palm flat against a large outcropping and held it there. The stone was warmer than the air around it, warmer than the season had any reason to explain. She noticed the smell next, faintly mineral, faintly damp, like the air at the bottom of an old well. It was coming from the base of the slope, from beneath a rough construction of rotting planks and dried mud, pressed against the hillside like a forgotten door. Someone had sealed it deliberately, long enough ago that the mud had cracked in long lines, and the planks had gone the gray of weathered bone. She stood there looking at it for a full minute. Around the sealed entrance, the ground was bare. Not frost bare, it was October, and frost had already come twice to the valley, but no snow lingered there. Not a trace. She filed that fact away and walked back to help with the unloading. The next 2 days were occupied entirely with the work of settling. There were crates to unload, a stovepipe that had come loose at the second joint during the wagon ride, flour sacks that needed to be moved off the damp floor before the night cold could pull moisture through the boards. Her husband was a practical man and a willing one, and between them they made the cabin habitable in the way that frontier cabins become habitable, not comfortable, not finished, but functional enough to sleep in without dread. She worked steadily and said little. That was her way. She had learned early that observation required a kind of interior quiet, and she had learned to protect that quiet the way another person might protect a flame in wind. On the second afternoon, while he was patching the north wall where the chinking had fallen away, she returned to the debris field behind the cabin. There was genuine work to justify it. Someone had left a scatter of old boards, rusted barrel hoops, and a broken wagon, spoke piled against the base of the hill, and it wanted clearing. She began stacking the usable wood and setting aside the rot. Working close to the hillside, she noticed again what she had noticed before: the absence of frost along the base. The ground 5 feet out from the slope held it in thin white patches. The ground directly against the hill was bare and faintly dry, the soil loose and dark, rather than locked and pale. She crouched and pressed 2 fingers against the mud that had been packed around the frame of the sealed entrance. It was not warm the way a hearthstone is warm. It was warm the way the earth sometimes is in spring, a slow, unconvinced warmth, as though the cold had tried and found something underneath it that refused to yield. She rocked back on her heels and looked at the planks. They were gray and soft at the edges, swollen in the grain the way old wood gets when moisture has worked through it long enough, and yet the mud around the frame stayed dry. That was not a thing that happened without a reason. Then she heard it. She was not sure at first that she had heard anything. It was less a sound than the idea of a sound, something faint and high, carried not through the air, but through the wood itself, the way a voice carries through a wall when a house is quiet enough. She leaned forward. She pressed one ear to the least rotten section of plank and held her breath. There it was again, thin, distant, unmistakably alive. She could not name it yet. It was too faint for that, too filtered through wood and mud, and whatever distance lay between the planks and the source. But it was not wind. It was not the creek. It was not any sound the hill itself would make. She straightened up slowly, looked at the entrance for a long moment, and then gathered her armful of usable boards and carried them to the woodpile without saying a word to anyone. She would come back in the morning, alone and early, before the day had demands. She was back before the light was full. The valley was still gray, the frost on the cabin roof not yet decided whether to melt or hold, and she crossed the yard with a short pry bar borrowed from the toolbox her husband kept beneath the workbench. He had asked where she was going. She had told him simply, the tunnel. He had pulled on his coat without further question, which was one of the things she appreciated about him, and followed her out into the cold. The planks were worse in the early light than she remembered them. 3 of the boards had rotted through at the nail holes so completely that the iron had simply pulled free, leaving the wood hanging in place by habit rather than fastening. She worked the pry bar under the edge of the lowest board and leaned into it, and the board came away with less resistance than expected, a soft, fibrous tearing rather than a crack. Her husband took it from her and set it aside. She listened before pulling the next one. The sound was there even now, even with them standing close, and the morning bird starting up in the scrub along the creek. A thin, reedy thread of something. She did not say anything yet. They worked steadily, board by board, the mud crumbling away from the frame in dry, chalky clumps that did not behave like mud that had seen recent moisture. She noted that. She noted everything. When the last board came free, the opening stood perhaps 4 feet high and 3 wide, irregular at the edges, cut into the hillside with old tools and not much care. The air that moved through it was warmer than the morning air outside. Not warm like fire, not warm like a stove. Warm like a root cellar held against the season, a steadiness, a patience, an underground temperature that had simply refused to follow the weather into autumn. Then the first one came out. It stepped carefully over the stone lip of the entrance, blinking at the pale light, and stood in the yard as though assessing the situation with reasonable caution. It was small, smaller than any goat she had ever seen, no taller than her knee, with short, thick legs and a coat matted flat with something pale and mineral, as if it had been dusted with chalk. Its eyes were amber and clear and completely unafraid. Then the rest of them came. They did not rush. They filed out in an unhurried column, blinking, picking their way over the threshold, spreading quietly across the yard and the dry grass at its edges, and she stood with her hands at her sides and counted, because counting was what she did when she did not yet understand something and needed to begin somewhere. 68. She counted twice to be certain. Her husband said nothing. She said nothing. The goats moved between them without concern, cropping at the frost-stiffened grass, their small hooves quiet on the hard ground. She looked back at the tunnel entrance. The warmth was still coming through it, steady and unhurried like breath. She let the goats have the yard. That was the first decision, and it came without deliberation. They had already claimed it, quietly and without fuss, and there was no practical reason to dispute the matter. Her husband watched them from the fence rail, turning his hat slowly in his hands, the way he did when he was working something through. She watched the tunnel entrance. The warmth coming out of it was not dramatic. It did not billow or gust. It simply persisted, the way warmth persists inside a root cellar long after autumn has stripped the air outside down to its cold bones. She picked up the lantern from the porch step, lit it with the striker she kept in her apron pocket, and walked to the entrance. The planks her husband had pulled away lay scattered in the dirt. The opening was low. She had to angle her shoulders to pass through. But once inside, the passage widened enough to walk upright. The floor was uneven shale, smoothed in places by years of small hooves. The smell was mineral and dry, faintly animal, with something underneath it that she could not name at first, and then recognized as warmth itself. The particular odor of a space that has held heat so long, the heat has become part of its character. She moved carefully, holding the lantern at shoulder height. The passage ran straight for perhaps 20 feet, then bent to the left, and then she was in the chamber. It opened wider than she had expected. The ceiling arched perhaps 8 feet above her in the center, rough cut and dark, and the walls curved outward into an irregular oval, maybe 30 feet across at its widest point. The coal seam was visible as a black band running through the far wall, thick as a man's arm in places, thicker in others, and from it came the warmth, not intense, not scorching, but constant and even, like the heat from a banked fire that has burned for so long it no longer requires tending. Along the left wall, a thin film of water seeped down the rock face and collected in a shallow natural basin worn into the floor. The moss grew here, dark green-black, close-cropped, spread in patches across the damp stone, and trailing in thin ropes to the dry ground beyond. She crouched and touched it. It was resilient. It came away from the rock easily and smelled faintly of earth and iron. She stood and turned slowly, letting the lantern move with her. The goats had been here long enough to wear the floor smooth in a wide central area. There were no signs of distress, no bones, no evidence of anything having gone wrong in a very long time. They had had water, warmth, and something to eat. Modest provisions, but sufficient. The chamber had maintained them the way a good cellar maintains winter stores, steadily, without waste, without spectacle. She looked up at the ceiling, then down at the basin, then at the coal seam. She began to measure the space with her eyes. She took her measurements home in her head, the way a surveyor carries numbers in a field book. Precise, committed, ready to be worked with later. Her husband had been waiting near the tunnel mouth. He had watched the goats settle back toward the entrance in the mid-afternoon warmth and had counted them twice, arriving at the same figure both times. 68. They agreed on that number without ceremony, the way you agree on the height of a fence post. It is what it is, and now you work with it. Word travels quickly in a small valley. It does not require intention or malice. It requires only one person mentioning an unusual thing to one other person at the trading post, and within 3 days, a thing has visited every kitchen table within 6 miles. By the end of that first week, 4 neighboring families had ridden out to see. By the end of the second, there had been 7 more. They came in wagons mostly, and they stood at a respectful distance and looked at the goats the way people look at something they have already decided is foolish. The animals were, by any standard the valley applied, remarkably small, short-legged, thick through the body, with coats that had grown dense and rough in the dark. They moved in calm clusters, unhurried, and regarded the visitors with the mild indifference of animals that had not learned to be afraid of people. This somehow made the laughter easier. The comments were not cruel exactly, but they were consistent. A man from the eastern end of the valley said they looked like something a child had drawn when asked to draw a goat. A woman who ran a small dairy operation 2 miles south said she doubted the lot of them together would fill a single milk pail. Someone called the claim more cursed than ever. First the shale, then the dry creek, and now a tunnel full of animals too small to do a day's work. The laughter that followed was genuine and not particularly unkind. It was simply the laughter of people who had survived hard winters and knew what survival required, and who had concluded, at a glance, that these animals did not have it. She stood through each visit with a level expression and said very little. But she asked questions, the same 2 or 3, offered in different forms to different people. How cold had last winter run? How long had the ground stayed frozen the winter before that? Whether anyone had lost cattle to a cold snap in the past 5 years? And if so, when it had hit and how fast? The answers varied in their particulars. They agreed in their direction. The valley winters were not merely cold. They were occasionally catastrophic, arriving with a speed that left no time for preparation and lasting long enough to break what the cold alone could not. She thanked each person for their time. She watched the wagons roll back down the track. Then she turned toward the tunnel and the hill and the hillside above it, and she began, in her careful way, to think forward into winter. She began with the debris. The tunnel chamber held years of accumulated matter, crumbled coal dust, dried mossy leavings, the packed residue of animal habitation that had gone undisturbed long enough to become almost geological in its layering. She worked from the entrance inward with a short-handled spade and a wicker basket, moving slowly and without urgency, pausing often to let the goats settle and resituate themselves around her. They were not afraid of her any longer. They had decided, with the blunt practicality of small animals, that she was a fixed feature of the chamber, and they moved around her boots and leaned against her shins and watched the spade with expressions of mild professional interest. She did not widen the entrance by much, only enough that she could pass through without turning sideways, and enough to admit a better flow of air in the warmer hours of the afternoon. She was careful about this. The tunnel's warmth was its chief virtue, and she had no intention of trading that virtue away for convenience. She learned the goats in the way one learns any small and particular population, by observation repeated over many days until patterns emerge from what first appeared to be mere randomness. Some came forward willingly at milking, others required patience, a steady hand held still at chest height, a period of simply being present without demand. A handful were contrary in ways that seemed almost personal, and she gave those extra time and no special treatment, which appeared eventually to be exactly what they wanted. The yield per animal was modest. She had not expected otherwise. These were not dairy cattle. They were small creatures who had survived on mineral water and dried moss and the thermal warmth of a coal seam, and what they offered in milk was proportional to what they had been given. But she had learned by the second week of October to do the arithmetic without letting the per-animal figure mislead her. 68 goats milked twice a day produced something the arithmetic could not dismiss. She measured each session carefully, noting the yield in a small ledger she kept on the tunnel's shelf ledge alongside her spade and her milking cloth. The numbers climbed slowly, but they climbed. She rendered her first soft cheese in the last week of October, using a square of cheesecloth she had cut from an old flour sack and a flat stone she had smoothed with a bit of creek gravel. It was mild and faintly mineral, not entirely unlike what she had eaten once at a farm farther east. She set it on the shelf beside the ledger and stood looking at it for a moment before returning to her work. Outside, the valley moved through its ordinary autumn. Corn was laid in, firewood was stacked. Conversations in the trading post concerned themselves with prices and weather, and the particular character of the coming cold, which the oldest settlers had been predicting since August would be severe. She heard these conversations. She kept her own counsel. And each morning she returned to the hill. The cold came in the second week of December with no gradual courtesy, no warning frost to prepare the valley for what followed. It arrived as a wall, a pressure system that moved down from the northern ranges and dropped the temperature 40 degrees in less than a day. She was in the tunnel when it happened, and she knew it only by the sound the wind made overhead, a low, sustained note that rose and then steadied into something that felt less like weather than like a decision the sky had made. By the third morning, the creek had stopped moving, not slowed, stopped. The surface was not merely iced, but sealed, the water beneath it locked as though it had never intended to run at all. She walked the claim's perimeter before dawn and felt the crust under her boots carry her weight without breaking, the kind of cold, hardened ground that takes weeks of accumulated freeze to build. The grass was gone beneath it, not buried, erased, pressed flat, and glassed over until the hillside looked like something poured and set, not grown. She heard about the livestock from a neighbor who came by wagon on the fourth day, the horses blowing great clouds of breath, the man's face tight under his hat brim. He had lost 2 calves in the night. The Hendersons 2 miles east had a water trough frozen solid and couldn't break it, and their cattle had not drunk in 36 hours. The hay stores, which had seemed adequate in November, were burning through at twice the expected rate because the animals were burning heat just to stay alive. He did not stay long. There was nothing to say that the cold had not already said. She went down into the tunnel each morning before first light, carrying the lantern on its hook, and the warmth met her at the entrance the way it always had, steady, faintly mineral, indifferent to whatever was happening on the surface. The goats had drawn back into the deeper chamber weeks earlier, as though they had read the season correctly and made their arrangements. They were compact and calm, tucked against one another in the middle dark, and they rose for milking with the same patience they had shown in October, in September, on the first strange morning when they had spilled out into the autumn air. The lantern threw long shadows up the tunnel walls. The wind above was audible even here, a deep vibration she felt more than heard, and she worked steadily through each milking, her hands warm from the animal's heat, the pail filling in its slow, reliable rhythm. The ledger numbers for those early December mornings showed no drop. If anything, the cold seemed to have settled the herd further, quieted whatever restlessness the autumn had carried. She poured the morning's yield into the covered crocks she had lined along the tunnel shelf and stood a moment in the warm dark, listening to the wind work against the hill above her. Outside, the valley was learning what the winter intended. Down here, the milk was still warm. The surplus began quietly, as most important things did. By the second week of December, she was pulling more milk than two people could use, even accounting for what she poured back into cooking, into the small morning porridges, into the butter she worked in a clay bowl with a wooden paddle. The crocks lined the tunnel shelf in orderly succession, covered with squares of clean cloth weighted at the corners. She ran her finger down the ledger column one evening and held the lamp close to the numbers. The yield was not shrinking. If anything, a handful of the older does, the ones she had privately come to think of as the steadiest of the herd, were giving slightly more than they had in October. She had known, somewhere in the back of her practical mind, that this moment would come. Abundance has its own kind of pressure. She thought of her mother's kitchen. She thought of a low shelf beside a cold window, and a piece of cloth twisted over a bowl, and the slow gravity of whey working itself loose over 2 days. It was not a complicated thing. Cloth, salt, patience. Her mother had said it exactly that way, as though naming the 3 ingredients of some older and more essential recipe than bread or soup. She cut squares from a worn flour sack and scalded them in the pot. She salted the milk carefully, not heavily, just enough to coax it, and poured the first batch into the cloth and hung it from a peg inside the tunnel, entrance where the air moved slightly. She checked it morning and evening the way she checked everything, without urgency, with attention. By the second morning, the whey had drained clean into the bowl beneath, and what remained in the cloth was pale and soft, and smelled of nothing but cold and salt, and the particular cleanness of the goat's milk itself. She tasted it on the back of a wooden spoon. It was mild. It was good. She made 3 small crocks that week. 2 went to their own shelf. The third she held in her hands a long moment, thinking of the elderly woman who lived in the low-roofed cabin nearest the creek bend, the one whose brown cow had gone dry before Thanksgiving and who had not been seen at the trading post in more than a fortnight. There was no illness that anyone had mentioned. There was only the quiet that settles around a person when the winter has closed their options down to a narrow corridor. She wrapped the crock in a piece of burlap and tied it with a short length of twine. She rose before her husband that morning, dressed in the dark, and walked out into the blue-gray pre-dawn cold with the crock under her arm. The snow was hard and loud underfoot. She set it on the old woman's doorstep, knocked once, lightly, not enough to wake her, and walked back the way she had come. She told no one. The valley did not yet know what was being decided on its behalf. The old woman was seen at the trading post 4 days later. She bought a small sack of cornmeal and exchanged a few words with the storekeeper. That was all. But she was there, and she was upright, and that was enough. January arrived without softening. The temperature dropped in the first week and did not rise again. The creek froze solid 3 inches deep, then 5. The snow that fell was dry and fine, sifting under door gaps and collecting in the corners of window sills like chalk dust. Firewood stacks that had looked generous in November began to look insufficient. People counted their stores with more care than they had counted them before. By mid-January, the valley's condition was no longer a private worry. It was a shared fact, acknowledged in brief sentences exchanged between neighbors. How many head had been lost? How much hay remained? What the flour barrel looked like at the bottom? One homesteader 2 miles east had gone out one morning to find his entire cattle herd huddled dead against the eastern fence line. 7 animals. He had borrowed heavily to buy them in the fall. He stood at the trading post and said it plainly, without drama, the way men on the frontier sometimes delivered catastrophe as a piece of information to be filed away. People looked at their boots and said they were sorry. Rumors travel in winter because there is very little else to carry. By the 3rd week of January, something was moving through the valley's lean conversations. A piece of information so improbable that it circulated half as curiosity and half as rumor, which is the only way improbable things travel before they are confirmed. The rocky claim on the hill, the one everyone had dismissed in October, still had milk, fresh milk, not salted butter packed from autumn, not powdered or preserved. Fresh, from animals that were apparently still alive and producing in the worst cold anyone could remember. They came on separate days, and they came quietly. A woman from the south end of the valley, whose 3 children had been sharing a single cup of broth at supper. A man whose wife was nursing a new infant and whose own cow had stopped giving in December. A family whose goats, larger goats, common ones, had died in a collapsed barn. She received each of them at the door without ceremony. She did not mention October. She did not mention laughter or predictions or the word worthless, which she had heard applied to this land more than once. She simply listened to what they said they needed, considered what she had, and measured out what she could spare into whatever vessel they had thought to bring. But she was thinking clearly now about what fair exchange might look like. The tunnel was warm, the goats were steady, and the valley was only getting colder. She kept a small ledger, not a ledger in the formal sense. She had no proper account book, but a folded sheet of brown paper she had found pressed inside a crate from the wagon, smooth enough on one side to hold pencil marks. She wrote in columns what she had given, what she had received, what was still owed, what she had refused. The refusing mattered as much as the giving. She would not take coin. Coin was useless when the trading post road was impassable, and the town 2 hours away might as well have been 2 states. What she needed was what the land would need when it thawed. She asked the woman from the south end of the valley for flour, 20 pounds to be delivered when the road cleared, in exchange for a week's worth of milk. The woman had flour laid in. She said yes before the offer was finished. She asked the man with the nursing wife for fence posts, cedar if he had them, pine if he did not. He had cedar. He had cut them in September and stacked them against his barn, meaning to set a new corral line before the snow came. He had not gotten to it. He said he would bring them in February when the drift settled. She agreed and filled his jar. She asked the family whose larger goats had died for seed corn, a full sack spring variety, whatever they had stored. They brought it within 3 days, hauling it on a hand sledge across the frozen creek because they could not wait. She did not question the urgency. She stored the sack under the cabin floor where it would not freeze, and she filled their crocks twice in gratitude for the promptness. Each arrangement she recorded in her columns. Each one she completed, with the same level tone she brought to feeding the animals in the morning or checking the tunnel entrance before the wind rose. There was no theater in it. She was not performing generosity. She was working. The same way she had worked every day since they had pulled the rotting planks from the hill and watched 68 small animals walk out blinking into the autumn light. By the middle of January, 6 families had come. By the end of it, 9. The 10th came in the first week of February. A neighbor she had only ever seen at a distance. A quiet older man who kept his own counsel and his own property, and who arrived at her door holding his hat in both hands, like a man entering a church. She let him in out of the wind. He said he had heard she was making cheese. She said she had begun to, yes. Small rounds, soft, wrapped in cloth, and aged for 3 days, in the cool outer section of the tunnel where the warmth gentled into cool. He asked if she would consider trading for timber. She said she would consider it. He left with 2 small rounds wrapped in cloth and a promise to return with measurements. She entered the trade in her ledger that same evening. Timber, to be confirmed. It sat at the bottom of the page like a question that had not yet become an answer. The blizzard came 4 days later. She felt it before she saw it, a drop in the air pressure that made the animals restless in the tunnel below, a particular stillness in the afternoon sky that had no softness in it. She spent the last hour of light carrying extra provisions down through the secondary passage she had mapped 6 weeks earlier, a narrow-angled shaft she had found when she traced a draft of warm air along the tunnel's east wall. It ran upward at a shallow grade and opened inside the small lean-to built against the cabin's back wall. She had noted it in her ledger with careful measurements and thought nothing further of it until the first hard cold came and the main entrance froze solid for 3 days. After that, she had used it regularly enough that it no longer felt like a discovery. It felt like a door. The snow began after midnight and did not stop. By morning, the windowsills were level with white. By afternoon, she could not see the creek line. By the second evening, the cabin sat inside the hill like something the hill had swallowed whole, and the main tunnel entrance was buried under 4 feet of packed snow. She could not locate from the outside, even if she had tried. She did not try. She went in through the lean-to. She milked in the morning, as she always did, working by lantern light with the herd pressed close in the warm lower chamber, their breath making small clouds in the amber glow. She milked in the evening. She checked the water seep and the bedding and the condition of each animal with the same attention she brought to every other day. And then she climbed back up through the passage and wrote the figures in her ledger and ate her supper. 3 days the blizzard held. On the 4th morning, the wind stopped. The silence was so complete it woke her before first light. She dressed, lit the lantern, went down through the passage and milked, came back up, wrapped 3 crocks in cloth, and was standing at the front door with them in her arms when she heard the first shovel strike frozen ground outside. She opened the door before they finished digging. 2 neighbors stood there with snow to their knees and expressions she could not entirely read, something between relief and the particular discomfort of a person who had expected to find a problem and found instead a woman already at work. She held out a crock. She said the morning milk was still warm. The neighbors came back the next day, and the day after that. Word moved the way it always does across a frozen valley, slowly at first, then all at once. A family from the North Draw sent their eldest with an empty crock and a dozen eggs wrapped in straw. The miller's wife came herself, walking the full distance on a trail her husband had broken with a sledge, and she brought a small sack of cornmeal and said nothing beyond thank you, which was enough. Each trade was written in the ledger in plain figures. Nothing given away, nothing taken without fair exchange. The woman understood, perhaps better than she ever had before, that charity poorly managed breaks the thing it means to repair. By the third week of February, the cold had lost something of its authority. The creek was still locked, the ground still iron, but the angle of the light had changed. She noticed it first in the tunnel, the way the upper passage smelled faintly different in the morning, a loosening in the air that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with season. The herd noticed it too. The animals stood closer to the upper entrance, lifting their small heads toward the faint gray light that filtered down. She began planning in earnest then. She walked the hillside with a stick, marking where the fence line would run. She measured the tunnel mouth and paced out the dimensions of what a proper entrance would require. Wide enough for a small cart, low enough to keep the warmth from escaping. Her husband cut the posts. She drove the first one herself. The trades had accumulated into something solid. Stacked along the south wall of the cabin were fence posts, more than 30 of them, good cedar. In the root cellar sat 2 cloth sacks of seed corn and 1 of winter wheat. Against the hillside, under a canvas weighted with stones, lay 12 lengths of milled timber, enough for a real floor and a proper door frame for the tunnel entrance. None of it had come from luck. Every piece had come from milk and from cheese wrapped in cloth and carried through snow, and from the quiet decision made in the first cold days of autumn to pull the rotting planks away from a hill everyone else had walked past without curiosity. The freeze broke for good in the last week of February. She was standing on the hillside when it happened, not dramatically, just a shift in the wind, a smell of something distant and wet. Below her, the valley lay still pale and exhausted, the way a thing looks when it has survived something it was not certain it could survive. She turned back toward the claim. The fence posts were waiting. The soil beneath the dead grass would soften in another week. The goats, all 68 of them, were moving in the tunnel below her feet, warm and alive and already hers.